My wife and in-laws threw me out of my wedding. After I paid $25,000 now THEYRE begging for mercy. Imagine spending $25,000 in the perfect wedding, only to be thrown out by the people you trusted most. That's what happened to me, but I didn't crumble. I fought back, and what I did next left everyone speechless. How does a moment of betrayal turn into the ultimate story of revenge? Stick around, because you won't believe how this ends. I stood at the entrance of the grand ballroom, my heart pounding like a war drum. The room ahead was a dream come to life, gleaming chandeliers, casting golden light on tables, draped in pristine white cloth. Every seat adorned with silk ribbons. A sea of guests filled the space, their chatter echoing off the high ceilings, blending with the soft melody of a string quartet tucked in the corner. The air was thick with the scent of fresh roses, imported from some European countryside at no small expense. Every detail, every flower arrangement, every glass of vintage champagne cooling in silver buckets, had been chosen with care. I'd spent months planning this moment, pouring in every ounce of my energy, every dollar I could spare, to create something unforgettable. I wanted perfection for her, for Celeste, for us. It had been a journey to get here. Years of building a life together, of laughter and shared dreams, of weathering ups and downs as any couple would. Through it all, Celeste had been my anchor, the one I'd believed would stand by me no matter what. Tonight wasn't just about a ceremony. It was a celebration of us, a symbol of everything we'd overcome. I looked down at my cufflinks, adjusting them nervously. They were a gift from her last Christmas, polished silver engraved with my initials. A small gesture, but it had meant the world at the time. Now, as the minutes ticked by and I still didn't see her at the altar, a knot began forming in my stomach. Something felt off. I scanned the room again, my eyes moving over the familiar faces, friends, family, colleagues, everyone dressed to the nines, their smiles wide, and their hands cradling delicate flutes of champagne. Still no sign of Celeste. My breath hitched slightly, though I forced myself to remain calm. She was probably running late. Brides always took their time, right? Isn't that part of the tradition? A small chuckle escaped my lips, though it did little to ease the growing unease. Then, a movement at the far end of the aisle caught my attention. For a moment, relief washed over me, but as I looked closer, my heart sank. It wasn't Celeste. It was her mother, Margaret Hayes. Margaret walked slowly, deliberately, with a confidence that had always put me on edge. She wore a deep midnight blue gown, its fabric shimmering under the warm lights, and her expression carried that trademark smirk. I'd come to recognize a blend of superiority and something darker. Her gaze locked onto mine as she reached the front of the room. I opened my mouth to greet her, to ask if she knew where Celeste was, but she raised a hand to stop me. "You're no longer needed," she said, her voice cutting through the ambient noise like a razor. At first, I thought I'd misheard. The words hung in the air, too sharp, too deliberate to be a mistake. My mind scrambled for context, for meaning, but I came up empty. What are you talking about?" I managed, my voice steady but my gut churning. Margaret tilted her head, that smirk deepening. "Celeste has made a different choice," she said smoothly, as if she were discussing the weather. "She won't be marrying you today. She won't be marrying you at all." For a moment, the room felt frozen. The chatter died down. I could feel hundreds of eyes on me, their stares heavy, uncomfortable. I turned my head slightly, hoping, praying to see Celeste step forward and laugh, to say this was some cruel joke. But instead, she appeared from the shadows near her mother, stepping into the soft light. She looked radiant. Her dress, a designer piece that had taken months to custom fit, was a masterpiece of lace and beading, flowing down her figure like liquid silk. Her hair was styled in those soft waves I adored, and her makeup was flawless. For a second I would later curse, my heart leapt at the sight of her. But then I met her eyes. They weren't filled with the warmth and love I had known for years. Instead, they were cold, indifferent. She looked at me as though I were a stranger. "Celeste," I said, my voice low, edged with disbelief. "What is this?" She tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "It's over, Adrian," she said softly, her tone almost pitying. "I've made a different choice." I stared at her, waiting for something, anything, to give me a reason, an explanation. But all I got was Margaret's laughter. short and sharp, as if my confusion were amusing. "Did you really think," Margaret said, her voice dripping with condescension, "that my daughter would actually marry you?" The blood drained from my face, my hands clenched at my sides. I couldn't process it. We had spent months planning this wedding together. I had done everything, picked the venue, worked overtime to pay for the best caterers, the best musicians, the best everything. And now, in front of everyone I knew, they were telling me it was over? I didn't get a chance to respond. A man stepped forward from behind them. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a tuxedo tailored to perfection. Theo Sinclair. I knew him. I'd met him once at a gala Celeste dragged me to. He was a corporate attorney, arrogant, the type who always thought he was the smartest guy in the room. Theo wrapped an arm around Celeste's waist, his hand possessively resting on her hip. My stomach churned. "Meet my future husband," Celeste said. This time, her voice was cruel, laced with a satisfaction that made my skin crawl. The room seemed to sway around me. People were whispering, murmuring, gasping. I could hear it all, but it felt distant, like I was underwater. I thought about every moment we had shared, every promise we had made, and I felt them unraveling all at once. My mind screamed at me to shout, to demand answers, to make a scene. But then, something shifted. They wanted me to react. Margaret's smirk told me that much. Celeste's cold eyes told me that much. They wanted me to break, to rage, to prove that they were right to choose someone else. So I did the only thing I could. I smiled. Not a defeated smile. Not a broken one. But the smile of a man who had just decided how this story would really end. Without a word, I turned and walked out, the gasps and whispers following me into the night. I felt the cold air hit my face, sharp and biting. My chest was tight, my mind spinning, but deep down, I knew one thing. They thought they had won. They thought they had broken me. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. As I stepped outside into the crisp night air, the magnitude of what had just happened started to hit me. The streets were quiet, the only sound the faint hum of distant traffic, and the occasional gust of wind rustling through the trees. I walked toward my car, my body moving on autopilot, my mind racing in a dozen directions at once. I felt the sting of betrayal deep in my chest, sharper than anything I'd ever experienced. I thought I knew Celeste. I thought I knew Margaret. I thought I knew my place in their world. But the events of that evening had ripped away every illusion, leaving me staring at a raw, ugly truth. I'd been nothing more than a pawn. Sliding into the driver's seat, I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles turning white. My breath came in short, uneven bursts. Every detail of the ballroom replayed in my mind. Every word Margaret had spoken. Every cold glance Celeste had thrown my way. I could still see Theo's smug face, the way he wrapped his arm around her waist as if he'd won a prize. The memory made my blood boil. All the effort I'd poured into that wedding. All the late nights spent working to afford it. All the dreams of a future with Celeste. They'd used me. They'd planned this. For a moment, I felt my vision blur as anger and hurt threatened to overwhelm me. I slammed my fist against the dashboard, the sharp thud echoing in the confined space. The car felt too small, too suffocating. I needed air, needed to think clearly. I fumbled with the window controls, letting the cold breeze whip across my face. It helped, if only slightly. I stared out at the streetlights lining the empty road. Their glow steady and indifferent. The world hadn't stopped. The world didn't care. The realization cut through me like a knife. This wasn't some last-minute decision. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment betrayal. The way Margaret had smirked, the way Celeste had stood there so calmly, this was orchestrated. Margaret must have been planning this for weeks, months even. Every time I had been working late, thinking I was building a future for us, they must have been behind the scenes, pulling strings, setting this up. I thought back to the little comments Margaret had made over the years, her subtle digs at my job, her not-so-subtle hints that Celeste deserved more. At the time, I brushed them off. I thought she was just a difficult woman, the kind who couldn't be pleased no matter how hard you tried. But now I saw it clearly. She never intended to let me into their family. She just wanted to use me until someone more suitable came along. And Theo. God. Theo. I barely knew the guy. We'd crossed paths at a fundraiser once. Some high society event Celeste insisted we attend. He'd been charming, sure, but I never thought he was a threat. Celeste had mentioned him in passing a few times, always casual, always dismissive. But now, it all made sense. She'd admired him, probably even before we got engaged. The way he exuded confidence, the way he carried himself, it was all just a matter of time before Margaret decided he was the better option. I leaned back against the seat, staring up at the ceiling of the car. My chest felt tight, and for a brief moment, I thought I might start crying. But the tears didn't come. Instead, a slow, burning anger began to take hold. I could feel it spreading through me, replacing the initial shock and pain. They had humiliated me in front of everyone I knew, stolen the day I had worked so hard for, and now they were probably celebrating, thinking they had gotten away with it. The image of Margaret raising her glass in triumph, Theo whispering something smug to Celeste, made my jaw clench so hard it ached. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction. They thought I was just going to disappear quietly, tail between my legs, a broken man. But they were wrong. Dead wrong. If they wanted a fight, they were going to get one. I might have been blindsided tonight, but now I was seeing everything clearly. I had the resources. I had the knowledge. And most importantly, I had the drive to make sure they paid for what they'd done. Not just Margaret. Not just Theo. But Celeste, too. She was no innocent bystander in this. She had chosen to stand by her mother's side, to humiliate me, to betray me. She had made her bed, and I was going to make damn sure she lay in it. I pulled my phone from my pocket, scrolling through my contacts, until I found the number I needed. It was late, but I didn't care. This couldn't wait. The call rang twice before a voice answered, groggy but alert. Adrian? What's going on? I need your help, I said, my voice steady, controlled. I've got a situation, and I need to start moving on it now. There was a pause on the other end. What kind of situation? Fraud, I said simply, and betrayal. Big time, the voice sighed. You realize it's after midnight, right? I realize, I replied sharply. But this can't wait. Trust me. Another pause. All right, the voice said finally. Tell me what's going on. I took a deep breath and began explaining everything: the wedding, the betrayal, the money Margaret had funneled out of my accounts, the transactions I'd found when I'd reviewed my statements earlier that week. It all came tumbling out, and as I spoke, the anger in my chest burned hotter. By the time I finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Well, the voice said finally, you've certainly got a mess on your hands. Yeah, I said. But I'm not going to let them get away with it. The voice chuckled, low and knowing. I figured as much. So, what's the plan? I stared out the window, watching the wind push the bare branches of a tree under a street lamp. First, I need to make sure they don't get another cent from me. Freeze everything, pull every transaction, and flag anything that looks even remotely suspicious. I want their access to my accounts completely cut off. Consider it done, the voice replied. What else? I'm going to expose them, I said. Margaret, Theo, Celeste, everyone involved. They humiliated me in public, so I'm going to return the favor. But I'm going to do it the right way. No yelling, no messy confrontations. I'm going to hit them where it hurts. And where's that? The voice asked. Their reputation, I said, their precious status. They built their lives on appearances, on what people think of them. I'm going to tear that down piece by piece. The voice was silent for a moment. Adrian, are you sure about this? I didn't hesitate. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. The call ended, and I set my phone down, staring at the screen as it went dark. For the first time since that night began, I felt a sense of clarity. They thought they had won, but the truth was, the game had just started. I wasn't going to walk away quietly. I wasn't going to let them erase me. If Margaret, Celeste, and Theo wanted to play dirty, I'd show them what it meant to face someone who had nothing left to lose. I was ready. They were going to regret ever crossing me. So, what do you think happens next? Do they finally face justice, or do they find a way to slip through the cracks again? Comment 1 if you think they'll get what's coming to them. Comment 2 if you think they'll manage to escape the consequences. I'll wait. Go ahead. The first thing I needed was proof, real, tangible evidence that Margaret and Celeste had orchestrated everything. I couldn't rely on anger alone. I needed a solid foundation, a trail of facts to expose what they had done. So, I went back to the source of their power: money. Every dollar they spent to create their illusion of wealth, every unauthorized charge they slipped past me, every transaction that felt even slightly off. If I could unravel their financial trail, I'd have the ammunition I needed. And once I had that, they wouldn't just be humiliated. They'd be finished. Late that night, I sat in my apartment, the glow of my laptop casting a harsh light in the otherwise dark room. I was surrounded by piles of papers, printouts of bank statements, credit card bills, and receipts I'd requested over the past few weeks. I'd suspected something was wrong before the wedding, small discrepancies in my accounts that didn't make sense. At first, I'd brushed them off as mistakes or minor oversights. Now, I realized I'd been blind. These weren't accidents. They were part of a calculated scheme, and I was finally putting the pieces together. I started by pulling up my online banking history. The first red flag was easy to spot: a series of spa charges from a high-end retreat in Napa Valley. I hadn't been to Napa in over a year, and I certainly hadn't authorized a $2,000 weekend package. Then there were the shopping sprees: designer boutiques in Beverly Hills, charges for handbags, shoes, even a custom-tailored tuxedo that was definitely not mine. The total was staggering. Thousands of dollars drained from my account without my consent. Margaret's doing, no doubt. She'd found a way to get access, to skim off the top while I was too busy planning a wedding to notice. But the financial theft was just the beginning. I dug deeper, combing through emails and text messages I'd archived, looking for patterns I might have missed. And there it was, a string of conversations between Celeste and Margaret that I'd overlooked before. They weren't labeled anything suspicious, just innocuous subject lines, like weekend plans or meeting notes. But once I opened them, the truth was clear. Margaret had been coaching Celeste for months. The messages spelled it out: how to handle me, what to say, how to ensure I never got suspicious. One line hit me like a punch to the gut: keep him distracted. Once Theo's in place, we'll move forward. They had been planning this all along. I leaned back in my chair, running a hand through my hair. The weight of it all pressed down on me. It wasn't just about the money or the public humiliation anymore. They'd used me, manipulated me, turned me into nothing more than a stepping stone to their next target. But I wasn't a victim, not anymore. Now that I had the evidence, I could turn the tables. I could fight back. The next piece of the puzzle was Theo. I didn't know much about him aside from what I'd seen that night. But that smug grin of his had told me everything I needed to know. He wasn't just a random new love interest. He was part of their plan. Margaret and Celeste wouldn't have thrown me aside for just anyone. Theo had to be someone who could provide them with more than I ever could: money, connections, status. And if he was in on it, there would be proof. I just had to find it. I started with the obvious: social media. I scrolled through Theo's carefully curated profiles, searching for any clue that might link him to Margaret and Celeste before the wedding. At first glance, his accounts were polished, professional. Photos of him at corporate events, charity galas, and luxury vacations. But the further I dug, the more the connections emerged. A picture from 6 months ago: Theo and Margaret at a wine auction, standing side by side, smiling like old friends. A tagged post from a mutual acquaintance, showing Theo and Celeste at a private dinner long before I'd even met him. They hadn't just crossed paths by chance. They'd been moving in the same circles for years. The final piece fell into place when I checked the guest list from our wedding. I hadn't paid much attention to it before. Celeste and Margaret had handled most of the invites, but now I saw the pattern. Several of the attendees weren't friends or family. They were business associates of Theo's, people I'd never met. Margaret and Celeste had used my wedding as a networking event for their new alliance. I felt the anger surge again, but I forced it down. Anger wouldn't help me now. Focus would. I stayed up the rest of the night piecing everything together. I created a timeline of events, starting with the first suspicious charges on my account, and ending with the moment Margaret publicly humiliated me at the altar. Every email, every receipt, every photo went into a digital file. I wasn't sure what I'd do with it yet, whether I'd take it to the authorities, the press, or confront them directly. But one thing was certain: I was no longer playing defense. I was preparing to strike back. As the sun began to rise, I sat back and stared at my laptop screen, the folder labeled evidence glowing in the corner. I had everything I needed. They thought I was done, that I'd just fade into the background and let them move on with their lives. But they were wrong. I was just getting started. Armed with the evidence I had spent days piecing together, I knew it was time to take the first shot. There was no point in hiding what they'd done, not anymore. I wanted them exposed, laid bare for everyone to see. They'd turned my wedding into a public spectacle. It was only fitting that I returned the favor. The tools at my disposal were simple: a burner social media account, a few well-timed posts, and the undeniable truth. I didn't need lies or exaggerations. The documents, photos, and messages I'd uncovered spoke louder than any embellishment ever could. I sat in my living room, laptop on the coffee table, a cup of black coffee cooling beside me. The apartment was quiet, the early morning light creeping in through the blinds. I could still feel the remnants of that restless night, the tension coiling in my chest, but I channeled it into purpose. With a deep breath, I began drafting the first post. No theatrics, no sensational headlines, just the facts. Imagine spending years building a life with someone, only to find out you were nothing but a means to an end. Imagine discovering the people you trusted most were stealing from you, lying to you, planning your replacement while you were busy planning a future together. This isn't just a betrayal, it's a calculated scheme. Here's what really happened. I attached the screenshots of the bank statements, clear evidence of the charges. Margaret had funneled through my accounts without my consent. The spa weekends, the shopping sprees, the down payment on a car I'd never seen. Each charge was dated, documented, indisputable. I added the emails I'd uncovered, showing Margaret coaching Celeste on how to keep me distracted, how to bide their time until Theo was in place. The messages were cold, clinical, devoid of any hesitation or regret. They painted a picture of two women who saw me not as a partner, but as a stepping stone. Finally, I posted a photo of Theo and Margaret from that wine auction 6 months ago. They were smiling, raising their glasses as if celebrating a win. To anyone else, it might have looked like a harmless event, but to me, it was proof of a long-standing connection they'd kept hidden. I knew people would connect the dots once they saw it all laid out. And that's exactly what I wanted. I hit post and leaned back, watching as the first notifications began to roll in. At first, it was just a trickle comments from strangers, a few likes and shares. But within minutes, the numbers started climbing. People were intrigued, outraged, eager to dig deeper. Some questioned whether it was real, but the majority were on my side. The evidence was too clear to ignore. And the reactions? They came fast and furious. Wait, she replaced him at his own wedding. What kind of person does that? Margaret sounds like a total sociopath. How can anyone be this manipulative? This guy has receipts. If it were fake, he wouldn't have all these documents. I hope they get what they deserve. I refreshed the page every few seconds, watching as the story spread. Each new comment, each share, felt like a small victory. The people who had once looked down on me, who had whispered behind my back that I wasn't good enough for Celeste, were now seeing the truth. They were seeing who Margaret and Celeste really were, and it wasn't pretty. As the post gained traction, more information started coming to light, details I hadn't even uncovered myself. People from Celeste's past began chiming in, sharing their own experiences, their own stories of manipulation and deceit. Someone who claimed to be a former friend of Celeste posted a screenshot of a private message. She did the same thing to her last boyfriend. Used him until she found someone richer. Looks like she just leveled up her game. Another comment caught my eye. I went to college with Margaret's sister. This isn't new, she's been pulling stuff like this for years. She taught Celeste everything she knows. I felt a mix of validation and anger. On the one hand, it was reassuring to know I wasn't alone, that others had seen through their facade. On the other, it infuriated me that they had gotten away with it for so long. But now? Now they couldn't hide. Their web of lies was unraveling, and I was the one pulling the thread. It didn't take long for the first brand to speak up. One of the luxury boutiques Margaret and Celeste frequented issued a public statement: "We do not condone the actions depicted in recent reports." Effective immediately, we are severing all ties with the individuals in question. That was just the beginning. A high-end spa chain followed suit, then a fashion label Celeste had been promoting on her social media. One by one, their sponsors, their connections, their carefully crafted image began to crumble. Margaret must have realized what was happening, because my phone started buzzing. Call after call, all from her number. I let them ring. I didn't need to hear her excuses, her attempts to spin the narrative. She had spent years manipulating others, but now she was out of moves. I could imagine her sitting in her upscale living room, surrounded by designer furniture she'd paid for with other people's money, desperately trying to stop the bleeding. But there was no stopping it. Not this time. Celeste tried calling too. She left a voicemail, her voice trembling, trying to sound apologetic. Adrian, I don't know what's going on. People are turning on me. I need to talk to you, please. I deleted it without listening to the rest. She didn't deserve my time, my attention. She had made her choice, and now she was facing the consequences. By the time the sun rose, the story had gone viral. News outlets were picking it up, reporters were reaching out for comments, and the court of public opinion had rendered its verdict. Margaret and Celeste were finished, their reputation in tatters. And Theo? He had gone silent. No public statements, no appearances. I couldn't say I was surprised. He probably thought disappearing would save him from the fallout, but I knew better. The damage was already done. They couldn't escape what they'd set in motion. I sat back, my coffee now cold, and looked at the screen. The comments kept coming. The shares kept climbing, but I wasn't refreshing anymore. I didn't need to. For the first time in weeks, I felt calm. I had started the process of exposing them, and now the world was doing the rest. I knew it wouldn't be the end of their schemes, not entirely. People like Margaret always tried to rebuild. But this time, they'd be building on ashes. And I'd be there to watch it all burn. The aftermath was like watching a dam crack, under relentless pressure. I didn't need to do much once the initial wave hit. The momentum I'd started was now carrying the entire situation forward on its own. As I scrolled through the growing backlash online, it was clear that Margaret's carefully crafted image was falling apart. I could almost picture her pacing in her oversized living room, snapping orders at her assistant, trying to stop a train that had long since left the station. It was almost laughable, this woman who once dismissed me with a wave of her hand, now flailing to keep her world intact. The thought should have brought some satisfaction, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. The sponsors had fled first, which didn't surprise me. I knew how fast corporations moved when scandal hit. They cut ties before the story even reached its peak, pulling their endorsements, erasing every photo, and releasing carefully worded statements about their commitment to ethical partnerships. It was exactly what I'd hoped for. Margaret had built her status on those connections, and now they were dissolving in real time. Her financial safety nets were unraveling, and she didn't even see the worst of it coming. The part that surprised me most was how quickly her social circle turned on her. I thought it would take longer. After all, she'd spent years ingratiating herself with the right people, attending the right events, hosting the right fundraisers. But in the end, even those relationships were as flimsy as her integrity. As more people came forward with their own stories, the narrative started to shift. What had been whispers in private conversations became public declarations. A former friend posted, "I'm not surprised. I saw the way Margaret used people to get ahead. She's just finally getting what she deserves." Another shared, "She always had that condescending tone, as if she was better than everyone else. Looks like the truth is catching up to her." It was as though they'd been waiting for someone to pull the curtain back, and now that I had, they were more than willing to help tear it down. Celeste wasn't faring any better. If anything, she was worse off. Margaret, at least, had years of maneuvering and experience to fall back on. Celeste? She was drowning. Every post she made to defend herself only added fuel to the fire. People would respond with screenshots, call her out on her lies, and pick apart her carefully constructed persona. The more she tried to spin the story, the more obvious it became that she had no idea how to handle the situation. And Theo? He disappeared. The smug grin I'd seen at the wedding, the confidence he exuded as he stood next to Celeste, was gone. No statements, no posts, no interviews. It was as if he'd vanished into thin air. He had played his part, and now he was either too embarrassed or too smart to stick around and face the fallout. I had to give him that he knew when to cut his losses. But the damage was done. Whether he stayed or ran, he was tied to Margaret and Celeste in the public's eyes. He couldn't just walk away clean. None of them could. As I sat in my apartment, watching the chaos unfold, a strange calm settled over me. For so long, I had been caught in their orbit, trying to appease them, trying to meet their impossible standards. And now, here I was, removed from it all, watching their empire crumble. The power they'd once wielded, the control they'd exerted over everyone around them, was slipping through their fingers. I didn't need to shout or rage or fight them head on. All I had to do was let the truth do its work. My phone buzzed on the table beside me. Another string of messages from Celeste. I didn't bother reading them. I could guess the tone, desperation, maybe some anger, an attempt to guilt me into stopping the storm. She might have even apologized, though I doubted it was sincere. Whatever she had to say, it didn't matter. She had made her choice. She'd stood by her mother's side, humiliated me in front of my friends and family, and thought I'd just disappear quietly. Now that the tide had turned, she was scrambling to salvage whatever was left, but I wasn't about to throw her a lifeline. She didn't deserve one. It was a strange feeling, being on this side of the equation. I'd always considered myself the calm, steady one. I wasn't the type to seek revenge, or revel in someone else's downfall. But this wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about justice. They'd spent years climbing on the backs of others, using people, discarding them when they no longer served a purpose. I wasn't the first, and I probably wouldn't have been the last if I hadn't stepped in. This wasn't just for me. It was for everyone they'd ever used. Every person who had been too afraid or too powerless to push back. I was making a statement, not just to them, but to anyone who thought they could get away with it. I poured myself a drink and leaned back on the couch, the amber liquid catching the light from the screen. It was quiet again, except for the occasional ping of new notifications. The storm was still raging online, but in here, in my small apartment, there was only stillness. I had done my part. I had exposed them. Now it was their turn to deal with the consequences. They thought they could use me. They thought they could walk away unscathed, but they'd underestimated me. And now, they were paying the price. As the fallout continued to spread, I began to notice something interesting. The people I once thought were firmly on Margaret's side, those who had smiled and nodded at her fundraisers, laughed at her cutting remarks, and praised her every decision, were starting to slip away. At first, it was subtle in absence here, a missed dinner there, but soon it became obvious. Calls went unanswered, invitations rescinded. Margaret's once loyal supporters were disappearing like smoke in the wind. I wasn't surprised. After all, I knew how fickle her world was. Loyalty in high society wasn't built on trust or friendship. It was built on convenience. And when someone became inconvenient, when their name started appearing in gossip columns for the wrong reasons, they were left to fend for themselves. Watching this unravel was surreal. I'd spent years feeling like an outsider in their world. No matter how much I tried, I never quite fit. I wasn't born into their circles, didn't have their pedigree. I thought that was why Margaret looked down on me. But now, as I saw how easily her so-called friends abandoned her, I realized something important. It had never been about me. It was always about her. Margaret had spent decades building an image of perfection, and now that it was gone, so were her friends. They weren't loyal to her. They were loyal to the version of her that they thought could help them, the one who hosted lavish parties and introduced them to influential people. Without that, she was just another name dragged through the mud, and no one wanted to be associated with that. Meanwhile, Celeste was in full damage control mode. She posted a lengthy statement online, filled with vague apologies and thinly veiled attempts to shift the blame. She claimed she had been manipulated, that she'd made mistakes, that she was learning from the experience. The response was brutal. Comments poured in, tearing her apart for playing the victim, for refusing to take responsibility. People saw right through her words. They knew what she had done, and they weren't buying the act. I watched it all unfold. Each new comment another nail in the coffin of her credibility. She tried to disable comments, but the screenshots and reposts had already spread too far. The internet never forgets, and Celeste was learning that the hard way. It wasn't just the online backlash that was hitting her. I heard through mutual friends, people who used to be mutual friends, that Celeste's social life was in shambles. People who had once admired her now avoided her. Invites to parties and events dried up. The brands that had featured her in their campaigns quietly removed her photos, deleted their posts, and pretended she had never existed. Even Margaret, who had always been the strong, unshakable figure in Celeste's life, seemed to falter under the pressure. For the first time, Celeste was standing on her own, and she was failing miserably. Theo remained a ghost, but his absence was deafening. I couldn't help but laugh at the irony. He had been so confident, so sure of himself that night at the wedding. Yet now, when things had truly gotten bad, he was nowhere to be found. He'd played his part in Margaret's game and vanished, leaving Celeste and Margaret to deal with the wreckage alone. I wondered if they blamed him, if they regretted choosing him over me. Not that it mattered. Regret wouldn't change anything. They had made their choices, and now they had to live with them. Despite everything, I still felt a strange mix of emotions. Satisfaction, sure. Relief, definitely. But there was also a lingering sadness. I had loved Celeste once. I had trusted Margaret, believed that she wanted what was best for her daughter, for our future. Now, that trust was completely shattered. The people I had once considered my family were nothing more than strangers. Cold, calculating strangers who had used me, and then discarded me when I no longer served their purpose. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but I was done trying to make sense of their motives. I didn't need their explanations or their apologies. I didn't need them at all. For the first time in years, I felt free. Free from the constant need to prove myself. Free from the endless comparisons, the backhanded compliments, the feeling of never quite measuring up. I didn't have to worry about pleasing Margaret, or meeting Celeste's impossible standards. I could finally focus on what mattered, moving forward. The chaos they had brought into my life was finally fading, and in its place was a quiet, steady determination. I didn't know exactly what my future held, but I knew one thing for sure: I wouldn't waste another second on people who didn't value me. In the end, that was the real victory. Not the exposure, not the public humiliation, not even the satisfaction of seeing them face the consequences. The real victory was reclaiming my own sense of self-worth. I had allowed them to define me for too long, to dictate how I saw myself. But now, as I watched them struggle to keep their heads above water, I realized just how much power I had given them, and just how much they had lost. I'll never forget the sound of that knock at my door. It was sharp and urgent, rattling through my quiet apartment like an alarm. I hadn't been expecting anyone, especially at that hour. I set down my coffee, the cup still warm, and stood. My pulse quickened. Even though I told myself it was probably nothing, just someone at the wrong door, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't a coincidence. Not tonight. Not after everything. I hesitated for a moment, then opened it. There she was. Celeste. She looked nothing like the woman I'd seen at the wedding. Gone was the flawless makeup, the designer gown, the confident facade. Her hair was disheveled, her eyes red and swollen from crying. She wore a plain coat that hung loose on her shoulders, like she'd thrown it on in a hurry. For a second, I almost didn't recognize her. This wasn't the woman who'd stood next to Theo, basking in her mother's approval. This was someone desperate, scared, maybe even a little lost. "Adrian," she said, her voice cracking. "Please, I need to talk to you." I leaned against the doorframe, crossing my arms. The urge to slam the door in her face was strong, but so was my curiosity. What could she possibly have to say? After everything she'd done, after the lies, the betrayal, why would she come here now? I didn't invite her in. I didn't say anything, I just waited. She hesitated, biting her lower lip like she was searching for the right words. "I made a mistake. I know I did. But this is ruining me. I need your help." I laughed. I couldn't help it. It was a bitter, hollow sound. "You need my help? Are you kidding me?" Her face crumpled. "I know you're angry, and you have every right to be, but angry doesn't even begin to cover it." I cut her off. "You stood there and let your mother humiliate me in front of everyone. You didn't just break off our engagement, you destroyed it in the most public, cruel way possible. And now you want me to help you?" "I didn't know it would go this far," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know." "You didn't know what?" I snapped. "You didn't know that betraying someone might have consequences? You didn't know that people might not be so quick to forgive and forget? That's rich, Celeste." She flinched at my tone, but I didn't care. For months, I'd carried the weight of her betrayal, the humiliation of what she'd done. I'd tried to move on, to rebuild, but now she was standing here, dredging it all up again. She had no right. "I'm sorry," she said, the words coming out in a rush. "I know it's too late, and I know it doesn't mean anything now, but I am. I'm sorry for what I did to you. For what my mother did. For everything." Her apology hung in the air, but it didn't land the way I think she hoped it would. Sorry wasn't going to fix what she'd broken. Sorry wasn't going to take away the months of pain, the sleepless nights, the questions that haunted me after she left. Sorry was too little, too late. "You don't get to do this," I said finally. "You don't get to walk in here and act like everything can be forgiven. You made your choice. You chose Theo. You chose Margaret's approval. You chose to humiliate me in front of everyone I care about. So no, Celeste, I'm not going to help you. Not now, not ever." Tears welled up in her eyes, but I didn't feel sympathy. Not anymore. She opened her mouth to say something else, but I didn't wait to hear it. I shut the door, the sound echoing in the silence of my apartment. I leaned against it, closing my eyes for a moment, letting out a long breath. She had finally shown her true colors. I had no more illusions about who she was. And as I stood there, I felt something shift inside me in acceptance of the fact that this chapter was truly closed. I wasn't going to look back. I wasn't going to let her pull me back into her world of lies and manipulation. Whatever she was dealing with now, whatever fallout she was facing, it was on her. It was her mess to clean up, her burden to carry. Not mine. Not anymore. For the first time in a long time, I felt free. I had barely closed the door before my phone buzzed on the counter. I glanced at the screen, another message from Margaret. She'd been texting me nonstop for days now. At first, I'd ignored them, letting her words pile up in my inbox. But tonight, after Celeste's unexpected visit, I found myself curious enough to read one. It wasn't long, just a few frantic sentences, pleading for a chance to explain everything. As if I didn't already know the truth. As if the web of lies they'd spun could be undone with a simple apology. I set the phone back down and walked to the kitchen, needing the distance. The city lights glowed through my windows, casting long shadows across the apartment. I poured myself a drink and leaned on the counter, staring out at the skyline. For the first time in weeks, I felt a strange sense of calm. It wasn't peace, not yet, but something close. Celeste's sudden appearance had left me more certain than ever that I'd made the right decision. She'd looked so different from the woman I thought I'd known. There was no confidence, no polished charm, just fear and desperation. I could still see her tear-streaked face in my mind, hear her trembling voice as she begged for my help. It should have moved me. Once, it might have. But now it only solidified my resolve. This was no longer about trying to fix what had been broken. That part of my life was over, and I'd finally accepted it. What mattered now was making sure they could never do this to anyone else. Margaret and Celeste had spent their lives manipulating people, using them as stepping stones to climb higher and higher. I'd been one of those stones, but I wouldn't be the last if I didn't act. My evidence, my voice, my story, these were my weapons. And I was ready to wield them. I sipped my drink slowly, the bitterness sharp on my tongue. I wasn't going to rush this. A fight like this wasn't won with a single blow. It took strategy, patience, precision. Margaret had taught me that much, even if she didn't mean to. She'd always been careful, always calculating her moves 3 steps ahead. It was time I did the same. I'd already taken the first step, exposing their actions for the world to see. But there was more to do. Connections to sever. Resources to cut off. Reputations to dismantle. I grabbed my laptop and sat on the couch, pulling up the documents I'd compiled. Every email, every bank statement, every photo was a piece of a larger puzzle. As I scrolled through the files, I thought about the people Margaret and Celeste had wronged. Some of them were friends of friends, names I barely recognized. Others were complete strangers who'd reached out after seeing my story. They had their own tales of betrayal, their own scars from Margaret's manipulations. Knowing I wasn't alone gave me strength. It reminded me that this wasn't just about my own redemption. It was about justice. I opened an email from a man named Richard. He'd been part of a business deal with Margaret years ago, back when I was still convinced she was simply a sharp-tongued, overly protective mother. Richard's message was blunt and bitter. Margaret had promised him a lucrative investment, only to leave him high and dry when the deal fell through. He'd lost a small fortune, his company never recovered, and Margaret walked away unscathed. Until now. Richard was willing to testify if it came to that. He'd been waiting years for someone to take her down, and he wasn't the only one. There were others. A woman who claimed Margaret had manipulated her out of a major charity position, tarnishing her reputation in the process. A former employee who accused Margaret of skimming funds from their department's budget. Each story painted the same picture. A woman who thrived on control, who saw people as tools to be used and discarded. And Celeste was her protege, following in her footsteps without a second thought. The thought made my stomach turn. I'd loved that woman once. I'd planned a future with her. I'd believed in her. Now, all I felt was a cold, hard resolve to see this through. No more second guessing. No more wavering. They had shown me who they truly were, and I had no intention of letting them hide from it. I glanced at the clock. It was late, but I wasn't tired. I wasn't sure I'd ever sleep soundly again until this was done. I took another sip of my drink and began drafting a plan. The social media post was just the beginning. I needed to contact the right people: journalists, attorneys, former allies of Margaret who had nothing to lose by coming forward. The more voices, the stronger the case. Margaret's world had been built on silence and fear, but that foundation was crumbling. I was going to make sure it collapsed entirely. My phone buzzed again. Another message. This one was from Theo. The name on the screen made me pause. I hadn't heard from him directly since the wedding. His text was short, almost casual, as if we were still on speaking terms. Adrian, we need to talk. Call me when you get a chance. I stared at it, the audacity of his request almost making me laugh. Theo, the man who'd stood smugly beside Celeste while I was humiliated, now wanted to talk? I couldn't even begin to imagine what he had to say, but that didn't mean I wasn't curious. I left the message unread and returned to my laptop. Theo could wait. They could all wait. This wasn't about them anymore. It was about me taking back control of my own life. About making sure they felt every ounce of the pain they'd caused me, and so many others. I wouldn't stop until they had nothing left, not the power, not the reputation, not the connections that had allowed them to hurt people for so long. This was far from over. And I wasn't going to stop until I finished what they started. By the time it was all said and done, I felt something I hadn't expected: relief. For so long, my life had been consumed by the anger, the humiliation, and the need to set things right. I thought I'd never get past it, that every step forward would feel like carrying a weight that wouldn't let me go. But now, standing on the other side of it all, I realized I'd made it. The fight was over. Margaret's world, her carefully constructed empire built on manipulation and deceit, was nothing more than rubble. Celeste's image, the one she'd crafted so perfectly on social media, in front of her friends, in every room she walked into, was shattered beyond repair. Theo? He'd disappeared entirely, leaving behind nothing but a bad memory. The final blow came in a way I hadn't even planned. One of Margaret's former associates, someone I'd never even heard of, came forward with documents that went back years: contracts, invoices, emails that showed her web of financial schemes stretched far beyond what I'd uncovered. When the story broke, it wasn't just a local scandal. National news picked it up, and suddenly Margaret Hayes was a household name for all the wrong reasons. Every outlet ran with it, not just detailing her crimes but painting a picture of who she really was: a woman who'd lied, stolen, and destroyed lives to maintain her position at the top. And just like that, her high society friends, the ones who had already started to drift away, vanished completely. No one wanted to be associated with her. She was toxic, untouchable. The same people who had toasted her at parties now pretended they'd never met her. It was almost sad, almost. But the truth was, she had done it to herself. Celeste tried to distance herself from her mother, but it was too late. The internet doesn't forget, and neither does the court of public opinion. Every comment she made, every attempt to shift the blame, was met with overwhelming backlash. People called her out, reminded her of her own part in all of it. She couldn't escape her connection to Margaret, and without her mother's protection, she was left standing alone. I heard from mutual acquaintances that she had moved out of the city, trying to start over somewhere far away, The thought of her running from the mess she'd helped create brought me no joy. I wasn't looking for her to suffer, I just wanted the truth to be known. And now it was. What surprised me most was how quickly my own life began to heal, once they were out of the picture. At first, I thought I'd carry the bitterness forever. But as the days turned into weeks, I found myself thinking about them less and less. I started focusing on the things I'd neglected during that dark period: my work, my friends, even my own hobbies. The weight that had been on my chest slowly lifted. I felt lighter, clearer. I could breathe again. I could see the path ahead, and for the first time in a long time, I was excited to walk it. I never responded to Margaret's last message, the one where she begged me to meet her, to let her explain. I'd already made my decision. There was nothing she could say that would change what had happened. She'd burned that bridge, and I wasn't about to rebuild it. As for Theo's text, I left it unread. He'd made his choices, and so had I. I wasn't interested in his excuses or his version of the story. All that mattered was that they were gone, and I was finally free to move forward without them. Some nights, when the city is quiet, and the only sound is the hum of traffic in the distance, I find myself looking back not with regret, but with a sense of clarity. I think about the person I was before all of this, the person who trusted too easily, who believed in people who didn't deserve it. That version of me is gone. What remains is someone stronger, someone who knows the value of standing up for himself. I didn't just survive their betrayal, I grew because of it. And as strange as it sounds, I'm grateful. Not for the pain, but for the lessons it taught me, for the perspective it gave me, for the person it helped me become. The future feels wide open now. I don't know where I'll end up or what I'll do next, but I know I'm ready for it. I'm not defined by what they did to me. I'm not defined by their lies or their cruelty. I'm defined by how I chose to respond, by how I chose to reclaim my life. I'm not looking back anymore. Margaret, Celeste, Theo, they're all behind me now. And I'm ready to see what's waiting just ahead. Now you've seen it all: the betrayal, the revenge, the downfall. But what would you have done? Would you have walked away, or would you have fought back like I did? Let me know in the comments. And if you're craving more stories that keep you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button and subscribe. You don't want to miss what's coming next. Trust me, it's going to be even crazier than this. Trust isn't just given, it's earned. I learned that the hard way. People may seem genuine, but their true intentions can be hidden behind charm and smiles. That's why it's critical to look closer, to ask questions, and to value actions over words. In America, where ambition often drives success, we need to remember that character matters more than connections. A flashy reputation means nothing without integrity. The lesson is clear: protect your resources, hold others accountable, and never let anyone treat you as disposable. Trust carefully, and when you find people who are honest and loyal, hold on to them.